The next bit of code that I want to introduce you to is JSON. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It is known as a lightweight data interchange format that is used for storing and transporting data. It's one of the most common methods we use when sending and receiving data over the web, especially when using web APIs. Wait a second, I thought we were talking about JSON. What's up with the API? Just in case you're unfamiliar with API, this stands for Application Programming Interface. It is a set of rules that define how two pieces of software talk to each other. You can think of an API as the middleman between your computer and the server that is hosting the data that you want to access. This could be something like the weather. The data request from the API is returned back to you in the JSON format. So you can think of an API as a way that different applications can communicate with each other. It's kind of like the messenger that lets your website or app request and receive data from another system. So when you open a weather app on your phone or computer, it's going to request the data from a weather API. The API sends back JSON data, and then we can display that information and give the user meaningful data about the weather. Okay, back to JSON. So JSON, remember, it stands for JavaScript Object Notation, is a lightweight format for storing and exchanging data. It's used in web development for APIs, configurations, and storing information in JavaScript applications. It's basically a syntax that is a simple text-based format based on a set of rules that are easily understood by both machines and humans. This is why it's so popular. We use key value pairs with the value being either a string, number, object, array, Boolean, or null value. So we use JSON because it's easy to read, meaning that it's human-friendly formatted, it's lightweight, it's much faster than its predecessor, which was XML. It's used everywhere, in web APIs, databases, and in settings files. And it works with JavaScript, but it's also used in many other languages. The basic structure of JSON is as follows. As I mentioned, JSON stores data in key value pairs. This is very similar to JavaScript objects. The keys are on the left, and they're always inside quotes. In this example here, our keys are name, age, email, and is student. The values on the right can be either a text string, such as John Doe, a number, such as 25, or a Boolean, such as true or false. We can also use lists, which are basically arrays, or objects, which are nested data. JSON relates to APIs in the following way. We will send and receive data in JSON format because JSON is fast to send and receive, it's human-friendly or easy to read, and it works with many programming languages, including JavaScript. In this example, I'm showing you a snippet of code where we are requesting data from a random user API. The JSON response might look like this. What's happening is the API returns user details in the JSON format. Your app can read this data and display it on a website. I'll show you how this works in just a moment. Before we do that, let me just let you know that APIs and JSON are used in web development. They're used in weather apps so that you can get temperature and forecast data from APIs. They're used in e-commerce, so you can get product information from an online store's API. They're used in social media. This is how we can see posts, comments, and other user details. And it's used in maps. The Google Maps API can fetch location data and give us meaningful information. Let's jump into our code editor so that I can show you an example of how we can fetch random data from an API and display it. In order to build a simple web page that fetches random user data from an API and displays it, we're going to be using this website called randomuser.me/API. As you can see, it is going to display results. If I check pretty print, the results are a little bit easier for us to read as a human, but this basically is an example of a JSON-based file. It's going ahead and storing a bunch of different detail about a user. So you can see here, this is a male, the title is Mr., there's their first name, their last name, where they live, the city, the time zone, their email, etc. A bunch of information. If I hit refresh, you're going to notice that the data changes, and now we're looking at a different user. So this is now a female user, and here's her specific data. We're going to go ahead and we're going to use some of this information so that we can display the user's name, their email, and a photo on a web page. In order to do this, we're going to need to use some HTML, a little bit of CSS, and some JavaScript that will allow us to hook into this API and retrieve this JSON data. So I've set up a basic HTML page, and currently this does not have any information on it whatsoever. I'll start off by creating a container that is going to store the user's information. I'm going to be using a div, and I'm going to give this a name of user-card. Inside this div, we will have an image that has an ID of user-image, an H2 that's going to display their name, a paragraph that's going to display their email, and we'll make a button so that you can easily just click the button to get a new user. If we save our page and look at it in the browser, you can see that it shows something like this. Now, obviously, the image is going to be broken and this doesn't have any functionality yet. So let's continue to build this out. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and open a script tag. This will contain the information that we need so that we can retrieve the information that we're interested in getting. Inside my JavaScript tag, I'm going to begin by using an asynchronous function. I'll do this by typing async function getUser. An asynchronous function in JavaScript is a function that does not block the execution of the rest of the code while waiting for a task. This is often used when we're fetching data from an API. So instead of stopping everything, it allows other tasks to run while we wait for the results. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to set up a try block, which is used to handle potential errors that might occur when we're fetching data from an API. I'll start off by typing try. I'll open a set of curly braces, and then inside here, I'm going to use const. We'll call this response, and we're going to set this equal to await fetch. And then we need to go ahead and put in the URL of where we want to request the data from. In our case, that is going to be the website that I just showed you. So inside the quotes, we'll put the URL of where we want to retrieve the information. What's going to happen here is the fetch is going to make a request to the random user API to get the user data. The await is going to pause the execution until API responds. And response is going to ensure that the response contains actual data before moving on to the next line. Constant is a type of variable, and the response from the API will be stored in this response variable. At present, this response is an HTTP response object, not yet the actual data. Normally, after fetching the response, we'll have to convert it into JSON to use it in JavaScript. We'll enter that data next. So after this line of code, I'm going to go ahead and type const data equals await response.json. This is going to convert the response into the JSON format. Keep in mind that the JSON format is that JavaScript object. Then what we want to do is we want to extract the first user from the API response. We'll do that by typing const user, And then we're going to go ahead and keep that information inside of an array. The purpose of this line of code is it's going to extract that first user object from the results array within the data object. So the API response is going to return an object with a results array. This is going to contain data about multiple users. We only want or need one user. So we're going to grab the first item in the array, which is the 0 index. This is important because the user variable now is going to contain or hold the actual data for a random user from the API. And now that we have that data stored, we can use it to populate our web page. The first thing that I want to display is a photo. So I'm going to go ahead and enter that text. We're going to use document.getElementById user image. This is allowing us to target this part of our HTML. We're going to go ahead and update the source attribute of the image with the actual URL of the photo so that we can display the user's picture. So when we use document.getElementById, we're selecting an HTML element by its ID. In this case, we're getting the user-image ID element. We want to affect or set the source attribute, and we're going to go ahead and use the medium size photo that is available for us within the randomuser.me API. And we're retrieving this information from the user.picture object. If we look at the website, you will see down at the bottom, here's the picture object, and we have 3 different sizes: large, medium, and thumbnail. So we're only interested in getting the medium size picture. This will allow us to dynamically update the image on the web page to display the user's profile picture. We're going to continue to retrieve information from the random user website and populate these different areas on our page. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I want to retrieve the username. We're going to use document.getElementById. We're going to target our username ID, and we want to use inner text. This is going to allow us to place the text node within the H2. Now we have a couple of ways that we could get the information that we need. The first thing that we want to retrieve is we want to get the user first name and the user last name. If we look at the randomuser.me, you can see that we have a name object, and we have something called first, which specifies the first name, and something called last that specifies the last name. Knowing that, we can use that information to retrieve the user's first and last name. We could do this by typing something like user.name.first, and then we could concatenate by using our plus sign and then having a set of empty quotes so that we have a space between the first and the last name. Then I'm going to use plus again, and I'm going to use user.name.last. And this should retrieve that information and print it into this area. Let's go ahead and let's populate the user email. Once again, I'm going to use my document.getElementById. This time we're going to go ahead and target the user email element. And once again, we want to use inner text, and we want to populate that with the user email. The next thing we're going to add is the catch. The catch block is going to go ahead and run an error in case there are any problems. The catch block is only going to run if an error occurs within our try block. So if anything goes wrong, potentially the API is unreachable, or maybe it returns an error, the program is going to jump to the catch block and handle the error. So this is important because it ensures that if an error is happening, it's not going to crash the page, and we can figure out what it is and handle the problem gracefully. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to print the error to the console, and we'll just go ahead and add a string of text that says error fetching user. and then I'm going to use a comma and I'm going to type error. This line of code is important because it will provide debugging information so that we can figure out what the problem is and how we can resolve it. This curly brace is the end of our catch block, and this curly brace is the end of our function for get user, and then obviously this is the end of our try block. After the function has run, remember that a function is like a mini program, all we need to do is simply call the function. So I'm going to just say get user, open close parentheses, and I'll terminate with a semicolon. This is going to call the get user function that we just created, and it's going to fetch the random user data when the page loads or when we want the function to run. So when we load the web page or we trigger this line in some way, and remember up here we have a button that's using onClick get user, this will also trigger the information to be fetched from the website, and it'll update the HTML with the fetched data. So let's go ahead and save this and let's switch to the browser. If we refresh our page, it's going to go ahead and populate this information. So you can see there's a picture, there's a name, and then there's an email. If I click our button, it should repopulate with a new user. And I can just continue to do that, or I can click the reset button here to continue to populate that information. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of CSS so that we can style the information so that it looks a little bit better on the page. Right now, we know that the code is functioning correctly, but we can make it look a little bit prettier. So that's what I'm going to do next. In order to do this, I'm just going to use embedded styles so I can easily keep everything on the same page. I'm going to go ahead and add the style code into the head section. I'll just do that quickly and then I'll explain what it is that I'm doing. I'll go ahead and I'll define the overall font family. I'm going to use text align center and an overall margin. I'm placing these rules on the body. Then I'm targeting the user card, which is the div that contains everything. We're going to put a border on that, add some padding, define a fixed width, set the margin to auto so it stays centered on the page. We'll add a little bit of border radius and a box shadow. And then for the image, I'm going to have the image display as being round, and I'm going to add a border. If we save this now and switch back to the browser, you can see that this works, but it just is going to be a little bit neater in the way that it displays. Now, if we want to get some other information, let's just say we also want to display maybe the city that the user is from. We have that information right here. So if I go into the randomuser.me API, this is all of the information I can retrieve. So let's say we want to display where the user is from. We want to put their city and their country. We can do that by modifying the code that we just created. So what we'll do is we need to create a location to display the user's city and country. I'm going to give this an ID of location. What we're going to do is we're going to type some static text, and then we'll go ahead and populate the information into this span element. And we're going to need to give this an ID as well. So let's give the span tag an ID of user-location. The reason that I have an ID on the paragraph is I want to format this text slightly differently. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my CSS. We'll use hash location, and we're just going to have the text have a font style of italic, and we'll change the color of the text to be a mid-tone gray. And then we can go into our JavaScript and we can do something similar to what we did when we retrieved the user name. So I am going to go ahead and use my document.getElementById, and the ID that I want to get is going to be my user location. Once again, we're going to use .innerText. And we're going to make this equal to, and we could do something similar to what we did up here, where we have the user.name.first. If we reference our JSON file, we have location, and location contains a number of information. So location, and we want to get city, and we want to get country. So we're going to use location.city and location.country. We're going to type user.location.city. So we'll print that first. We can do the same thing we did up here, where we concatenate a space, but there is another method that we can use in JavaScript, and I'm just going to use it this time. Normally, I wouldn't mix the data types, but I just want to introduce you to a different method of retrieving the data that you might encounter in your JavaScript files so that it's not confusing to you. So instead of doing what we did above, I'm going to use the template literal syntax in JavaScript, which is used for string interpolation. It basically allows us to embed expressions inside of strings using a $sign. So I'm going to go ahead and use a $sign. Then I'm going to open up my curly brace right here. And inside of the curly brace, I'm going to have user.location.city. I'll close the curly brace, and then I'm going to have a space, and I'm going to put $sign. And then in the curly braces, we're going to use user.location.country. And in order to have this work correctly, we need to encapsulate this information within backticks. So these are different from the single quotes. We need to actually use the backticks, which kind of go a little bit backwards. And if I write it like this is just another way that we can do the same thing that we had right here. So at this point, if we save our code and open up the browser and go back to our page and refresh, you can see that it says from, and then it has the city and the country. And every time I get a new user, we're going to see that information. This is a little light, so let's jump back to our code and let's just augment our CSS and make this a little bit darker. And that looks a little bit better. So as you can see, this is super useful. It allows us to be able to hook into an API that has a bunch of data. We can determine what data we want to display. We can control how we want the data to look. And this is going to dynamically update every time the page is refreshed or the user clicks our button. So what we've learned here is how we can hook into an API. We can make a call to an API. We can convert the response to JSON information, and then we can update our page content and load it into the page. This should hopefully be an introduction to how JSON works. And the final thing that I want to mention is, how does JSON relate to WordPress? Well, WordPress typically is going to store the data inside of a MySQL database, but we do use JSON in the following areas. The WordPress REST API is the main use of JSON. WordPress provides a REST API that allows developers to get and send data in the JSON format. An example of this would be fetching all posts from a WordPress site. We also have the theme.json file, and this is used for full site editing. The WordPress block themes use this theme.json file to control global settings like typography, colors, layouts. So instead of writing CSS or PHP, themes will now define styles inside of JSON. And these are things that control site-wide colors, fonts, spacing, layouts, and you don't have to write any CSS. It's controlled within the JSON file. JSON is also used in the Gutenberg block editor. So the Gutenberg block stores settings in the JSON format inside of the WordPress database. Custom blocks often import and export JSON information to store configurations. And finally, plugins and themes are going to store data in JSON. So some plugins and themes are going to store settings inside of a JSON file instead of using PHP or a database. For instance, if you ever use WooCommerce, it's going to export and import product data inside of the JSON format. So as we learn about child themes and how to modify our WordPress website, we will be looking at and modifying the JSON file, but I did want to give you an introduction for how JSON works so that when you get to that point of our course, you are familiar with the ins and outs of working with JSON.